I recently had a post that generated a lot of discussion, and it was about the what people refer to as the trans refuge law, which is, what is that technically?
It was House File 146.
Okay.
Last year's legislation.
So I had posted about it because this is absolutely insane to me, and I can't believe that having the conversation that I had generated so much pushback, a lot of support, a lot of quiet support actually, but publicly there was a lot of pushback. And so I wanted to meet with you and really to find out if I'm missing something, because I've gone through this, I don't know how many times. I talked with my sister, who was a business litigator for over 16 years in Minneapolis, super lawyer, knows her stuff frontwards and backwards. And so I knew what I was talking about before I went public with my commentary, and I couldn't get over the amount of pushback, the amount of confusion. And so I wanted to have a thorough discussion as to what this law really entails. And then I came across you from the Megyn Kelly Podcast. Mm-hmm. And I thought you had such a good handle on what this includes. Your background really speaks to why this is important to you. So why don't you start with your background and your professional credentials?
Sure, thank you. And by the way, you're in good company, because Megyn Kelly had the same question. Am I missing something?
Right.
And she's a lawyer.
Right.
So my background in this area goes back to the 1980s when I was in law school at William Mitchell. I volunteered as a guardian ad litem in Ramsey County down in St. Paul, which turned out to be kind of the pilot program for the state program they have now. 30 hours of training and pretty thorough involvement there. I served as a guardian ad litem for 3 years, and the job of a guardian ad litem in Minnesota is you're a court-appointed advocate for children whose futures are being decided by a court proceeding. And they don't like to have kids have to testify and argue their cases themselves. So guardian ad litems are appointed to a lot of cases where there's a certain risk level for kids. And your job as a GAL is to really get to know the child's situation, understand what the court's having to look at as options, and then make a recommendation to the judge. And the vast majority of the time, guardian ad litem recommendations are followed, just because the court knows that this is a neutral person who's been able to get close to the child and visit in their home, their school, talk to relevant people, several interviews with the child. And
that's what I was going to ask. This is a neutral position, so not brought on by either parent.
No, I'm just giving you my background.
Yeah.
This is your court-appointed person to give a neutral opinion about the child's situation and what's going to serve them best. So I did that for 3 years while I was in law school. And little did I know that would kind of peg me for family law, which, few graduating law students want to go into family law because it's messy and you don't make that much money. And I tried to somewhat stay out of it at first when I started my practice in 1992, but I just knew, I ended up, realizing that I know all these people who are going through this, and I know I could help them. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I need to at least be available to these folks. And so I ended up being drawn into that area of the law primarily. And part of it had to do with my personal opinion that in those cases, there's so much more at stake than just money. The stakes are high, and getting it right for kids particularly is, how do you put a price on that?
And what kind of cases, what did that involve that you oversaw?
There's basically 3 main categories of legal proceedings where kids kids' long-term futures are being decided, and in divorce cases, custody cases where the parents haven't been married, and then child protection cases where there's something has triggered the system where in juvenile court the court makes a finding that the child is in need of protection or services based on certain facts that are described in the statute, which kind of leads into, we'll get into this, but leads into what this bill did, creating a new category in that area. So when I went into private practice in '92, I ended up focusing on that. I ended up taking a number of cases in the area of contested adoptions where the same issue comes up, what's going to be best for this child? Is it?
Sure.
And those also were handled in the juvenile court proceeding. Juvenile court is interesting because it has a whole different set of rules than civil court, divorce court. And it's not as, it's kind of specialized because of that. And so attorneys who work regularly in juvenile court have a unique view of how that system works, which is another important piece to understand this legislation as to, what kind of proceeding would these, new standards be applied in. So that's why I was basically called on or pointed out when Minnesota Family Council and True North Legal, which is their legal arm, became aware of this legislation. They kind of just let me know about it because I had, I knew about them and had, collaborated with them on some things from the past. And they told me about this legislation, and so, I thought, like the sign says down by the airport, if you see something, say something. Right? It's like,
That's what my kids learn at school all the time.
Right? Yeah. And so I was like, well, I saw something, so I better say something. So I went, figured, found out when the committee was going to be having a hearing on the bill. And, I went down there, this is last year before it was passed. And, I signed up to speak, and they didn't allow anyone to speak on the bill except for the bill's author and a doctor who was going to benefit from this bill passing.
Oh, so you never got to speak?
No. They wouldn't allow it. The committee refused to allow it. Now, they were, they had a DFL majority in the committee, and that was how they wanted to get this bill pushed through, is to not have any open discussion on it. And
So they didn't have anybody speaking up at a podium that was pushing back on this bill?
Not at that meeting, no. I don't know that there were any, other than, what committees it did, we had hearings on besides that. But
which is wild, because we know now the vote passed by a small margin. I think it was 68 to 62. So clearly not everybody was in agreement.
Oh, right. Yeah. And there were certainly people in the middle margin there that were either they were going to decide its passage or not. I was pretty frustrated by driving all the way down to St. Paul and then for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, probably the best I can do is just maybe write up a memo and distribute it to the senators that are going to be voting on this when I hit the Senate floor. So I did that and included some of my, the research that I had looked into on it. And the interesting thing about this is that the term that's in the bill and is in the statute now, referring to gender-affirming care, comes from, my understanding is that it comes from a study that was done in Amsterdam, where they did a very short-term follow-up on some people who'd gone through transition surgery and treatment, and I think it was just within a year after, and their findings within that year after that was that most of them, probably a majority of them, said that, oh, this is great, I'm really glad I did this, I feel good.
So people who they did a study in Amsterdam, people who had transitioned from their biological sex, they followed up with them after just 1 year. And at that point, things were going
Sure, yeah,
fairly well.
They were still convinced this was great. Yeah. The problem is in the long term, and the Swedish study did a longer term follow-up. And what the Swedish study found, and they published this, is that the suicide rate among those post-transition individuals was 19 times higher than the average. So the suicide rate just skyrocketed with this group, and which is why Sweden outlawed this. And I mean,
And you're talking about post-transition.
Yeah.
The suicide rate went up 19%.
Yeah, and the narrative that have been handed to people, including professionals in Minnesota, is that if you don't buy into, this gender affirming measures, whatever it is, starting with just, using pronouns, but all the way through, as far as they want to go with it, if you don't buy into that you're going to be causing them to feel badly and commit suicide, if you don't affirm them. And the facts are that the, transitioning people is creates a much greater risk of suicide.
So I want to go back to when you first heard about the bill, and obviously with your experience in working with kids, some alarms went off. So what was it about this bill that rang the alarms for you?
Well, having worked in the juvenile court system for 30 years, actually longer than that because of work as a guardian ad litem, when the bill used terms like emergency custody and defined the denial of gender affirming care as a form of abuse, I knew exactly how that would play out in a child protection case. And there was an attempt by proponents of the bill to allege that this only applies to children who are non-Minnesota residents, who find themselves somehow in Minnesota, and the reason it was termed the Trans Refuge Bill is because the bill protected doctors from prosecution who did these transition surgeries on minors. Okay? So the bill attempted to protect them from any legal consequences, but it also created a safe harbor, they would call it, for children from out of state who were denied gender affirming care. And the timing on this is interesting because South Dakota had just months prior to this passing, they had made permanent transition treatments on minors a crime. So South Dakota, right across the border, had made it criminal. This was kind of a rescue bill in the eyes of the those who were proponents of it. They were going to rescue all these kids who needed this surgery and hormone treatment, thinking they were helping them. But either way, it's just as bad. To not be aware of the Swedish study and to not be aware is negligent. To know about it and still be a proponent of this, that's pretty wicked.
That's criminal.
So
yeah,
that's where it came down to for me, and I was like, I better say something.
I want to just read from the bill itself because I don't know how many people have actually have read what it says. So it says, a court of this state has temporary emergency jurisdiction if the child is present in the state and the child has been unable to obtain gender-affirming health care as defined in section 543.23, paragraph B. So you go to 543.23 to further read what does gender-affirming health care include. It means medically necessary health care or mental health care that respects the gender identity of the patient as experienced and defined by that patient, and that may include but is not limited to interventions to suppress the development of endogenous secondary sex characteristics, interventions to align the patient's appearance or physical body with the patient's gender identity, interventions to alleviate the patient's symptoms of clinically significant distress resulting from gender dysphoria as defined in the current version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and lastly, developmentally appropriate exploration and integration of the patient's gender identity, reduction of the patient's distress, adaptive coping, and strategies to increase family acceptance of the patient's gender identity. So when I read this, my first big red flag was if gender affirming healthcare, according to this, if a child is requesting hormone blockers or surgery, and the parent does not support that.
Right. Even though they might be getting counseling already.
Right.
And working, on it.
But the irreversible
Yep.
Medical interventions.
Yeah. So denial of those, if the child's asking for them, would bring them into the definition of a child that is at risk, is being abused or neglected under the statute, warranting emergency custody by the state.
Wow. I mean, okay.
It's very clear.
I know. And every time I go through this, I'm like, I don't understand. So a parent who knows their kid better than anybody else might see this as easily a phase they're going through, a lot of confusion. Adolescence is like the most confusing time in all of our lives. And refuses to allow any kind of hormone blockers, surgeries. They can have their child taken from them under this law.
Yes. And what specifically it's saying in there is that the parental rights established in another state would not override the emergency custody jurisdiction of the Minnesota court if the child was in that situation. So rather than the home state keeping jurisdiction in that situation, Minnesota would usurp it. That's what this is doing. That's why it's called the Refuge Bill.
Got it. So it applies more. Does it apply to Minnesota children?
Well,
or does it?
That's the question.
Okay.
On its face, it appears to apply to children from out of state. But the fact of the matter is that any lawyer with basic knowledge knows that if you say that we are going to protect children from a form of abuse, which this is being defined as, to refuse to give them hormone blockers and surgery, we're calling this abuse, warranting taking emergency custody away from another state. You can't not provide the same protection for in-state children. So anybody making a case for a child in Minnesota saying this statute has to apply to them because of equal protection, that's a solid argument. How would you even argue that?
Right.
If this is the standard to warrant emergency custody over, another state's jurisdiction, why wouldn't it apply here?
Yeah.
And they know, any lawyer writing this would know that. So to leave that, to make it look like it's just about kids from out of state, not that should be any comfort to anyone. I mean, do we want to?
Well, right. And what I think a lot of people don't understand is, if I understand this correctly, it's not, the parent isn't the one who would be intervening in bringing them to Minnesota.
Well,
so who has jurisdiction over this child? This
is where I want to explain the mechanism that this has tied itself into, the bill and the statute, is one that has been designed to really be very effective at protecting kids from immediate risk of harm. And, I think everyone would agree that if you said that, a parent's child's parents who know them best and, know what they need. Well, some parents aren't in that place.
Right. Yep.
Some parents, the kid needs to be protected from them right now.
For sure.
Right now. And before the parent has the ability to react to the idea that the county just got involved. So that's why they have the police power they do. Child protection, and the statutes that empower them. That's why they have that kind of power to save kids' lives. Okay, because there's people out there that really want to hurt their kids, and because they're mentally ill,
right,
or whatever. I mean, so that's the mechanism that already existed. So there's a long time precedent to why we give that kind of power to the courts in a case where a child is at risk of immediate harm. The idea that somehow denying a child hormone blockers or surgery creates an immediate risk of harm is incongruent. And I use that word very civilly. There's other words I could use, but this. How does somebody dream up the idea that this is somehow an emergency custody situation in the first place?
One of the counter arguments I always hear is that kids with gender dysphoria are high risk of suicide. And actually,
yes, that's the argument.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
I won't go too deep into this issue, but I do want to say, Chloe Cole has been, she's a detransitioner now. She's been very vocal about it. And one of the things she said is the doctors, when she was first going through her initial transition, when her parents were meeting with the doctors, unbeknownst to her, the doctors told her parents you could have, a child who transitions, or you could end up with a dead child. Mm-hmm. And they were threatening the risk of suicide. Mm-hmm. She says, first of all, she never knew that conversation took place until later. She also says she was never suicidal until she was wanting to detransition and go back to her biological sex.
Right.
So the whole argument is just a way to gaslight parents and a way to keep them silent.
Yep. And it is gaslighting in the most classic sense of it. It is a forming of a narrative to achieve an agenda that really attempts to make the person you're imposing the narrative on feel like they're crazy.
Right.
Okay. I mean, the fact that this passed in Minnesota should make everyone feel like, are we all crazy?
Right. Yes.
What are we doing?
That is how I feel
right?
every time I have this discussion.
You weren't crazy. You were gaslighted because there was an intentional strategy to keep this out of discussion, out of the public forum, and to not allow an open discussion, even down at the legislature when this was being passed. Mm. And there were accusations made and things said, like on the Senate floor by the bill's sponsor when they were discussing it before they voted on it, that when one of the senators brought up some of the things that were addressed in my memo, and one of the sponsors of the bill said, well, whatever lawyer wrote that should be reported to the board. And I thought, please do.
Yeah, good.
Please do. Let's get this out and get this conversation, anything to get the conversation going, because the fact that it was being hidden and gaslighted was very damaging, in my opinion. So, I mean,
did you not see the conversation of this bill, or now law? Did you not see it come to the forefront much until Walz was selected as VP?
Yeah, that escalated the discussion, which I'm very thankful in a way. I mean, Fox and Friends had me on a year ago when I think they contacted, Family Council, and they let them know that I had, tried to testify on the bill, and so they contacted me, and I had a brief interview on that show about a year ago, and it wasn't until Walz was appointed as the VP candidate that all of a sudden, what had been going on in Minnesota became more important.
Right.
And that's when Megyn Kelly contacted me and said, would you be on our show? So I'm kind of grateful that because of these things happening, what's been going on here is becoming more known than it would have. So
would have otherwise. I want to go back to the well, I know it's referred to as emergency jurisdiction, but who has, I guess it would still be jurisdiction over the child. So who is able to essentially bring a child to Minnesota and seek gender affirming care?
Anybody. You have to think of it in the same way as if somebody saw a child like sitting on the side of the freeway down in southwest Minnesota, and they stopped and they picked him up, and the child was in, needed food and medical care and shelter. The court wouldn't care who the Good Samaritan was. The law was created to protect the child. So it didn't matter who the person bringing the child in was, because the court was going to make its own determination if this child was in need of emergency care and custody, by the county. And the way this plays out in juvenile court and in child protection cases is that when the county takes custody of someone, custody, that's a word on paper, but what does that look like? Well, who are the people that provide care for the county for children in its custody? Foster care providers. And usually a shelter care, which is a different type of foster care than a long-term care, would be the first place these kids would go. I can tell you that the environments in the shelter care homes can be very high risk because of the kids that end up there. And, the ages go all the way up to 17 because they're minors, depending on what rules they have in the house and what kind of facilities they have. A lot of abuse occurs in the foster homes and shelter care homes, despite the county's efforts to avoid that. But it's just the nature of the thing. I mean, these are not, the kid isn't going into a well-established family that's functional and, does everything well.
So that's where, that is where this kid would potentially be placed?
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh.
Yep.
Got it. Okay. So let's say you had...
now, the county does have to look for relatives first.
Okay. Yeah.
But if they have jurisdiction, over the child in one county and there's no relatives in that county, then they can go to the next, level.
Okay.
So whatever the foster care. They have a way of fast-tracking and qualifying relatives so that they can provide care under the county's umbrella.
But assuming that's easier to come by to be with a relative if you're staying in state. But with this, if you're traveling out of state.
Not. Yeah,
right.
The likelihood of having a relative in the county under this scenario where they're talking about a child who lives out of the state is not very high. So
literally anybody could bring a kid into Minnesota saying they want to get surgery, their parents won't let them, so I'm here to save them.
Yep. Yeah. The same way if they were on the side of the road, injured and hungry and thirsty. I mean, same thing.
And that's all because this is essentially viewed as child abuse if you're refusing gender affirming care.
Yeah.
And to me, it's not just the irreversible medical damage that this poses to kids and that's happening everywhere, but also it says, while I'm all for counseling, and I think that's very important with kids who have gender dysphoria, who would be determining who that counselor is, or what is this therapist's idea of, are they in support of transitioning their kids with surgery? So, if this is, let's say I want to support, I'm somebody from out of state, I want to support my kid through therapy and they're fine with that. But what, are you allowed to choose the therapist? Is it a...
Well, it depends. I mean, if parents have been proactive in getting counseling care for their children, then they stay ahead of the game in that way. I guess what's more concerning is that legislation that also has been passed that was labeled conversion therapy bill requires that therapists in Minnesota, and it's regulated by licensure, the board and all that, but therapists in Minnesota as a result of this bill are being told they cannot counsel a child, a minor who has gender dysphoria or is confused about gender. They can't counsel them in a way that affirms their biological sex. That's conversion therapy under this bill. And it's not allowed.
Yes, that is what I was...
So because of that, therapists in Minnesota are under a restriction as to how they can provide services to their minor clients.
So even if a therapist was to say, if somebody came into their office saying, I think I'm born in the wrong body, could a therapist say, like, okay, talk to me about your friend group. How many friends do you have who are currently experiencing similar feelings?
Like, they could certainly ask that.
Okay. Well, if they were to, what kinds of things would they be limited to basically doing with?
Well, if a child had been told or somehow ended up believing they were in the wrong body, the therapist couldn't treat that belief or that notion itself as a problem, as a psychosis, as a mental illness, even though it's related in a sense to looking at something and going that's not what it should be, it's not real. Historically, mental health has rested on a definition of how well we're connected with reality, right?
Right.
The whole definition of being sound of mind has traditionally been, are you recognizing what's real, what's in front of you, and
and it's traditionally anybody who has been grappling with gender dysphoria in the past, it has been handled much differently.
Much differently, because you don't have to suggest that a person has the wrong body to affirm their feelings of confusion about what does it mean to be a boy or a girl. That has never been, that's a recent phenomena that's even been suggested.
Right.
Especially in a therapeutic setting.
Well,
because what it does is it creates a situation in the discussion, in the dialogue, that's no different from if a child, in the 60s was being harassed and discriminated against because of their race, and they went to a therapist, and the therapist said, well, maybe, you're and they were struggling with who am I? What am I about? And the therapist suggested to that person that maybe you're born in the wrong body because you're of color. I mean, we wouldn't tolerate that.
Right.
Why do we tolerate that with gender?
And to me, it's also akin to when I was growing up, there were so many girls that were grappling with anorexia and bulimia, and we saw a social contagion happening at that time. And it would, to me, it's like walking into your doctor's office when you are, 95 pounds and you're an anorexic teenager and saying, I'm fat and I'm feeling like I'm not right in my body and I'm overweight, and for them to affirm that idea of themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than say, and what some would try to set up as being the only two options is either you say, oh, okay, yeah, you're fat, and I'll help you, whatever you want to do, if you want to starve some more, or the other extreme, well, you're not fat, stop that, we're gonna give you electroshock therapy.
Right.
I mean,
right.
Those are the two extremes
Yes.
that are often put on the tables. Go, what do you?
Right.
No, there's always a third option.
There's always a third option. And kids can express themselves through clothing and through doing all kinds of things when I was a kid, I was a big tomboy.
Yeah.
And I feel like that.
Oh man, what would have happened to you?
I know. What would have happened? I feel like if I grew up in this generation where, I was wearing basketball jerseys and I've always loved sneakers, if I wasn't totally into my femininity yet, I think I would be very confused as to what that meant for me.
Yeah.
And that's so sad to think about what it's doing to kids right now.
And there's a whole movement out there called Save the Tomboys now.
Yeah.
Which I think is great. I mean, I knew girls that were tomboys when I was a kid, and it was like, I don't want to get in a fight with them because they'd probably beat the crap out of me. I was kind of a small kid, It's like, I wasn't, if somebody would have been set up for gender, issues, it would have been me back then. But
so many of us. Because that's just adolescence, and that's feeling uncomfortable in your body.
Yeah. And the last thing kids need is to add another layer of something that they can't fix without hurting themselves, being added to the confusion. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no therapeutic value in this. I think that one of the things, and I just would throw this out there because I was a pastor before I was a lawyer, and so that to say, spirituality is not a topic that's lost on me. And one of the things that used to be a given, regardless of what people's religious background might be, is that every human being has value because God said so. Mm-hmm. Done deal. But regardless of their athletic abilities, their color, their gender, race, that every human being had eternal and immeasurable value. When you lose that consensus in a culture, I think you see what we're seeing right now. Mm-hmm. Kids are the first ones hurt by it because they're the least equipped to deal with the confusion. So
I'm not sure how young you've seen these transitions take place, but I know I've heard of at least as young as 13. Mm-hmm. And I think they're doing it much younger now.
Oh yeah. I had a case where there was an 11-year-old boy who mom wanted to get him, on hormone blockers and tried to terminate the dad's joint legal custody. I don't have to mention names, but the case, since it's not a juvenile case, it was, the records are available. Oh, mm-hmm. So it's not confidential, but the mom wanted to, put him on treatments, and the father objected, and since they had joint legal custody, he couldn't get the treatments as long as dad objected, so she brought a motion to terminate the joint legal custody so she could go forward with this. And the judge had previously ruled on this particular case that if either parent brought a motion relating to this issue, that they would have to provide some research and brief the court on what their basis was for this. And the mom didn't provide that in her motion. Mm-hmm. We did. When dad hired me, and we provided 6 treatises, I think it was, on the issue, and the judge said, the moving party didn't provide what I required, so he threw out the motion, and they didn't bring it back in.
Amazing.
So that's the one, the litigation aspect that I had coming into this issue before all of this was brought up in Minnesota?
At 11 years old.
11 years old.
I mean, I have a 5th grader. He's 10. Still very much believes in Santa Claus. So you think about the concept of reality at that age as obviously different. I think about how we know enough that kids can't get tattoos until they're 18.
Even with parental consent.
Even with, yeah. And we know the frontal lobe isn't fully formed, which is, our impulse control, and how we can make decisions that we may regret later, though that's not fully formed until our mid-20s.
Right.
So I think the biggest offenders of this are actually not the parents, because I am sure that I'm not even going to say most, but many of these parents are doing really what they feel is best, and they're following what doctors are suggesting, what therapists are suggesting. To me, the biggest offenders are the lawyers and the medical professionals, because they are taught to look at all sides of the issue.
Yeah.
And it's mind-boggling that the lack of that thorough investigative approach to look at what's happening in Sweden, to hear out the stories of detransitioners who are being silenced left and right.
Yeah.
And what I have found is that they are, insurance is paying for transitioning, but there's no medical coverage for detransitioning.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, they're already sterile at that point. So,
right. And that's something I think so many people don't realize too, is what it actually does to these kids' bodies.
Yeah, it's criminal. I mean, the issue of doctors and lawyers, which you say, and I am kind of ashamed of the Minnesota bar that I don't see other attorneys stepping up and talking about this issue.
Why do you suppose that is?
Well, I know that there's a very strong mindset in the legal community that values progressivism and being, on the forefront of whatever. And it's the legal narrative, I should say, the narratives among members of the bar generally, there's exceptions, but generally is essentially anti-nuclear family. And there's a financial gain to be had.
Sure.
When you say, well, you should just change partners when you feel like it, and we'll just, hire us, and we'll just be managing the rest of your life. Maybe get that prenuptial agreement, divorce planning, get that done, and so then we'll just, when it gets challenged, which almost all of them do, then you can pay us again. We'll go in and have these academic discussions about why this should be enforced by the judge and not this. And, I mean, it's
so
just
pads the pockets.
Yeah, and that's a problem. But I can understand it with lawyers. With doctors, a more insidious process has happened in the medical profession. Is that doctors used to, were far more in a position of professionals. And when I say professional, in my understanding of professional, is someone who self-regulates their work, that they have an ethic, internal ethic, that they bring to that practice that it does not depend on profits, does not depend on anything but benefiting the community. And doctors, the Hippocratic Oath is first do no harm. Well, doctors cannot uphold that concept and, operate on 11-year-old kids to chop off their parts. I mean, it can't do it. But doctors have been treated more and more like employees over time because the HMOs has kind of taken over the medical profession and budged in on decision-making in the medical treatment area, which, and it's interesting enough, lawyers, the law with attorneys is that you can't share, retainer money with non-lawyers. You can pay employees to work for you, but you can't give anyone a split of your fee who's not a lawyer. And the reason for that is so that no one else has a say about your decision making in the case.
Sure.
Why isn't that true with doctors, for crying out loud? How much more is at stake with decisions that doctors make? And yet their hands are tied in many situations. So their ability to act as professionals has really been limited by what's happened in the industry. I mean, so you get those influences along with everything else, and it just makes this more just a bigger crag of quicksand.
Right. Well, and when you get a child young who's going to be requiring medical interventions for their life, I mean, that's a lifelong customer.
Yeah, right.
And so you can't help but wonder what the incentive is and the drive behind all of this, because at face value to me, it's absolute insanity. So then I have to think about, okay, who is benefiting from this? Because clearly it's not going to be the kids. And as much as people want to argue that it is, and that it's life-affirming care, which is the antithesis of it to me, I have zero doubts that years down the road, we're going to have all of the data that we need from everything that we've seen, all of the stories, that this was a colossal mistake.
Yeah. And now we refused to look at the stories in other countries who tracked this longer than a year. And, I don't know why do we need to go through the same loss of life that Sweden or Great Britain had experienced that brought them to the conclusion of outlawing it? Why do we have to go through that? Because we have to prove it ourselves? At the cost of the lives of people, kids. I mean, I can't think of anything more hostile to children than this.
I assume that was something that you probably spoke to in your memo. And in that sort of situation, did you ever hear back from anyone?
Nothing more than just thank you for the information. I mean, these are legislators. They go through tons of information a day, I'm sure. But some, I'm sure, have kept it, and I don't know. What could they do? They didn't have the majority. This was a party line vote, pretty much. And, it's already happened.
That's the other thing I want to talk about, too, because the fact that this has been politicized also is wild to me. And it seems to me that when I've had conversations about this, most people, no matter where they sit on the political spectrum, they are in agreement that this is crazy.
Yeah. I've gotten emails from people who are, say, they're registered Democrats, and they're like, "Thank you for bringing this out."
Right.
Why have they been so silent?
Right.
What my question is. I mean, is this no talk rule in Minnesota about things that are uncomfortable gone to such an extreme that we're going to watch children be destroyed over this?
Well, that's the problem.
Not saying anything?
Right. You speak up on behalf of this, and I was looking as to, okay, how is the mainstream media covering this? Because I'm pretty disconnected with the mainstream media. But it appears,
they don't want to touch it.
The few things I've seen is, I know, well, I want to talk about that too. But the few things I've seen is they haven't, or they worded it as a right-wing stance that right-wingers are elevating detransitioners, and it's taking away from the very real stories of students or kids who are transitioning. And I've gone back and forth on the political spectrum myself, but I just think this is so clear cut. This is just about kids and protecting kids. And I don't know how, even though most of the people I talk to can see that, there are some who are kind of blue, no matter who, that are defending this without really critically thinking about it.
Oh, well, that's interesting you use those words. One of the things I've seen in the school system, and those people who are close to me who've been teachers, and the whole thing about critical thinking is that, when I was a kid, there were things we did in school that encouraged that. You'd have open discussions about things. The teacher would try to get kids to talk about stuff. Open discussion. What do you think of that? What should be? And that, my understanding, that doesn't happen really anymore. Teachers are strapped with having to get through standards and run through things and teach to a test, and the skill of critical thinking is not being exercised and not being promoted, not being facilitated for our kids. And we have generations now who, really haven't been called on to think critically and, ask good, hard questions, because it's uncomfortable.
Right.
We've become a culture, I think, that worships comfort to the extent of, losing freedoms, losing quality of life, and watching things like this get run by us, and sitting in silence, being paralyzed by our own, shame or lack of feeling like I have a right to say anything. Or maybe I might lose something and might, if I do speak up. That's a bad place to be, there's been studies done on, what was going on in the culture preceding Nazi Germany. And we're mirroring this right now. It's serious, very serious. This is not a conspiracy issue. It's history. If we don't understand it, we'll repeat it. And we're at the doorstep of this now. So.
And by that you mean basically questioning, pushing back on, asking questions and being able to, look at things from different angles.
Yeah. To be, and to know that that's a good thing. Okay, that you're not bad for saying something that's uncomfortable. Right. At no point do we get it so right that anybody that questions it is now bad. We never get it that
right.
we don't ever have that down. We're always, So when we lose the permission, the encouragement to question things, we're in trouble.
I started to see the lack of critical thinking piece in the schools, because I was a high school English teacher for 12 years. And it was starting to, things start to creep into schools. And, I remember hearing this about how things happen in the colleges. And if you're not paying attention to what's happening in the universities, sooner or later they start trickling into grade schools. And so, last year, I became aware of, within our district, they were passing out sheets on the first day of school asking students their preferred pronouns. And then directly below that was what is the pronoun you want us to use, or you want me as a teacher to use with your parents. So they were basically saying, let me know what your preferred pronoun is, and then whether or not I can use that with your parent, or if I should use something else. And so there's already this secretive thing going on. And so, we see things start to trickle in slowly, and it's this division between parent and child that is such a slippery slope. And the moment we start to put more of a wedge between the two, especially when it comes from a government entity, that terrifies me. Of course, we have things in place to protect the vulnerable who do not come from good families, but this very much infringes upon your average kiddo who has a good relationship with the parents, and maybe just, is influenced by a friend group, and they're doing something at school differently than they talk about at home.
Yeah. Well, the secretiveness is pretty apparent, just even in the way this bill was processed.
Right.
It's a cultured norm. In any community you look at has has a normal when it comes to truth, how open you are, how secretive you are, what's okay, what's normal. And we criticize our, both sides of the presidential tickets here about their inaccurate statements, and sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's reckless, right?
Right.
But what we always try to find out is there an intentional pattern of deception going on? Is there an effort to try and keep things from us, the public, the voters, the people who want to have ownership in our way of life? Is there an effort to keep information from us in order to retain control? And that's an important question when it comes to what's allowed and what's normal in a culture, and what how does the news work? There was a point where investigative reporting was widely applauded. Some of the the Watergate and the whole investigation that happened there. The reporters were applauded for uncovering. Now you try to uncover something, you're a conspiracy theorist. You're bad. You'll be shut up. You'll be disbelieved. You'll be gaslighted. There is not a value today for uncovering what's there.
Right.
And that's scary. Again, I go back to what possible trends could we be seeing and where are they taking us? This should be scaring people.
Yeah, it's a very scary place to be when you are told to just trust, to be quiet. I woke up to all that in 2020 when I was told to trust the science, to not question the efficacy of, a shot that was moved forward, or whether or not I needed it, and I very much just was led by my intuition. I'm fine. I trust my immune system. I trust that I'm not putting others at risk by choosing not to get it. And it wasn't even just that we were told to not question it, but the vilification of those of us who decided not to get that shot was unbelievable. And it got me so hungry for really just uncovering the truth and looking at all different sides of an issue. Why? And looking at things from all angles and not just taking things at face value and believing what I'm being fed, because they've really shot themselves in the foot, because whatever the machine is trying to tell society now, a lot of us have our antennas up and are questioning everything. And so I think that's going to backfire when you have a society that really isn't trustworthy, isn't trusting anything that any messaging you're giving.
Yeah. It creates polarization, is what we're seeing now. Because, people are there's no, I'm a mediator by profession now. This is what I do. I got out of litigation a year ago. It's what I'm best at. There's a science to creating consensus. And there is a work involved in creating shared meaning between people, whether it's between two individuals or 2 billion. Okay, creating shared meaning between two people is the work of effective communication. And how do you find where there is already consensus and build on that? What's happened in the media now and in public communication process is the polarization has created a we-they mentality. There's no news channel that everyone trusts.
Right.
Where do you go to just hear the news anymore? because it's so slanted. And there aren't any news channels that are really doing the work that it would take to create a consensus to where, that people from all corners of the culture are going to go, oh, they have some things that are of value for me to hear.
Right, and predominantly because they're funded by,
Well, right. And I was going to say, we were talking about critical thinking. It's like one of the best questions you can ask, and as a critical thinker is, if you're trying to figure out what's motivating, so what's fueling a trend is, well, where's the money?
Yeah.
So, and that was certainly true with 2020 and some of the things that were happening there. Where's the money? I mean, I still see, way more pharmaceutical ads now than ever before on TV.
I know, and I'm pretty sure we are the only country that allows pharmaceuticals to advertise on TV, which is wild.
That's interesting.
Yeah, we seem to just allow all kinds of unhealthy habits and behaviors here.
Yeah, including what food we allow to be sold in the supermarkets, right? So,
yeah,
I'll be going to Spain in a couple of days, and I have to be prepared that what I won't find in the grocery stores. But fortunately, I don't really eat much of that anymore.
Right, I'm sure. I'm sure you have to very much watch what you eat to do a triathlon.
Yeah.
Fuel your body with the right food.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
Especially at my age. So
I'm excited for you. So, what is it that we can do? This bill came into law. So what can we do now?
Well, there's a few different potential futures with this. One is that the election coming up in November, if it changed the balance in our state legislature, this could be repealed, potentially.
Okay.
If that doesn't happen, I have no doubt that it's going to be challenged in the courts if they implement it. Now, I haven't heard of any cases yet. Doesn't mean they haven't happened, but if they haven't been challenged, where kids have been, the county's taken emergency custody over a child because they were saying they were not being provided gender-affirming care. But, if the first time that's challenged in the courts is going to be interesting, because there's, if the research, again, judges want solid research to make their decisions on, as I experienced with this issue in the courts. And that's in the family law arena. In juvenile court, I think that a judge faced with this kind of a case is going to really be nervous about not getting it wrong and not having a bad result. So my hope is that any judge getting this kind of a case where they're trying to apply this statute would require that the attorneys provide some solid research, and because that's going to go to the best interest of the child. What's going to give this child the best chance of success in life in the future. And if they do the research well, they're going to be handing the judge evidence that this statute was ill-informed and is harmful to kids if it were applied. I think that I'm hoping that would be the case. Now, I know better than to not realize that there may be judges that would go along with the agenda,
right,
and not do an independent assessment of how this is likely to affect the child long term. But they'd have to live with themselves, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And that's the worry. Even if a judge, even if most say, or statistically, if most judges wouldn't rule in the favor of taking a child away, reality is it allows them to do this
Yeah.
if they. So
Another scenario possibly is that we find a way to challenge this on a federal basis because it involves multiple states by its own design. You'd have, an interstate situation which would bring it into federal court, where you could challenge it on a constitutional basis, parental rights basis, and an organization like True North Legal might take that on. Renee Carlson, who's lead counsel for them. So that could happen. We'd have to get somebody who would act as a plaintiff on that, or be willing to take that on. But I don't know. I'm just praying it won't require the sacrifice of any kids before this gets fixed.
Right. Well, the more people we can have speaking up about it, educating people, sticking your neck out. Clearly, there's not a lot in the legal community who are doing it. So thank you for doing that.
Like I said, I saw something, so I'm saying something. So
I love it.